I have to say that I was a little bit sad to bring the narrow path study to a close. But you know, you got to stop at some point and go on to different topics. But I think, as I mentioned in the last lesson, the final lesson of that series, that the way that I see Scripture as being completely and totally integrated, one thing leads to the next. You could just literally take one topic and just continue teaching and teaching and teaching. So what I thought I'd do now over the next few weeks is just focus in a different direction and talk about the top 10 epic fails of the modern church. You guys know what I mean by that? You know, some of you guys are sports fans, right? You ever watch ESPN or Sports Desk? Even some of the local news channels do a lot of this. Every week they'll have a compilation of videos from the sports world where, and it can be quite entertaining, right? And they call it the fails. Like, so it can be like, baseball players dropping balls, or football players running into each other, or people running in the wrong direction, scoring on their goal, something that's just kind of funny mistakes. But when it comes to mistakes in the church, it's not so funny, is it? Because some of the errors of the modern church and the mistakes that we make are not just not funny, but they can have significant and sometimes eternal consequences. So we're going to take a look at what I personally see as some of the top 10 epic fails of the modern church, and we're just going to jump right in and look at number 10 here. And the first epic fail really comes out of my own history, my own background, because, and I've told parts of my story before, but I didn't get saved in the church until I was 31, which is a little bit late, right? Statistically, that's behind the curve, and most modern studies say that if you don't get saved by the time you're 19, 20 years old, chances are it's not going to happen. But I had this belief, I had this thought that we were smarter today than the early church was. And it's really kind of arrogant now that I look back, right? And so this idea that the church is more equipped to handle the word than the early church was, that we understand more about the Bible than earlier generations did, and that modern scholarship and prophecy add to or supersede more historical or even ancient understandings, I think is the height of pride and arrogance, and it was a sin that I committed. But what do I know, or what did I know, right? When you're born into the kingdom, you were born into the kingdom knowing very little. Now, no doubt, when we start looking around in modern civilization, some of the modern marvels, things that we as mankind have been able to accomplish, even in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, completely eclipse what our ancestors were able to accomplish. Man on the moon, deep space exploration, all of those different things. But in terms of general knowledge, not talking about biblical knowledge, but general knowledge, did you know that complex mathematics existed 3,000 years before Christ? Pretty interesting, right? Within 700 years or so before Christ came, we see drilling technology. We see underground sewer and water systems. We see cranes and precursors to modern roads and modern railways. And the ancient Babylonians had star catalogs as early as 1200 BC. So do we really think that we're smarter than our ancestors? You'd think so. You would think so. Hubert Humphrey, who was vice president back in the late 60s, he once said, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, he once said in a speech in 1977 that a civilization can be judged by how it treats its elders. Now, I'm taking this illustration, I'm stretching it just a little bit, but if that's true, that if regard for the elders and elder wisdom, if you will, is something that's so important and something upon which a civilization or organization can be judged, then the utter disregard that the modern church has for its own history is appalling. Do you guys agree or disagree with that? At least Vera does, which is good. We live in a world, now I'm not going to challenge anyone with this, we live in a Christian era where I would probably say that most Christians couldn't name all 12 apostles. I'm just going to read this list out and think to yourself whether or not you got it. So we have Matthew, Mark, we have John, we have two James, James the Greater, James the Lesser, we have Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, who was also known as Nathaniel, and then we have Thomas, Simon, Judas, who was known as Thaddeus, and then we have Paul. But I would say that most modern Christians couldn't name those. And they certainly couldn't name three of what are called the apostolic fathers. And these are leaders in the church in the end of the first century that some of them were contemporaneous with the apostles. Before we get to the era of the early church fathers, we have what we call the apostolic fathers, men like Clement of Rome and Ignatius and Polycarp, who were disciples of the apostles themselves. And while most Christians probably can't name the 12 apostles and these apostolic fathers and maybe some of the ante-Nicene fathers, they are intimately acquainted with the works of people like Joel Osteen, Rick Warren, Benny Hinn, looking at the video, T.D. Jakes, Joyce Meyer, Kenneth Copeland, Jesse Duplantis, Creflo Dollar, you name it, they know it. That's a big mistake. The modern church in this regard, I think, is like a rebellious teenager who's at a family gathering who has absolutely no interest in sitting down and hearing the life history and the wisdom of their grandparents. Never looking to the past for wisdom, but always looking forward for the things that are fresh and the things that are new. And, honestly, the attitude of the church should not be in discovering or developing new faith and new doctrine, but in rediscovering the faith of the early church, the ones that were closest to the source, who had fewer, although they did exist, but they had fewer external influences and even internal influences. You remember when we did the Narrow Path series, we talked about having a tenacious passion and pursuit for the truth at all costs. In that tenacious pursuit for truth, we have to seek the pristine faith. Now, what does the word pristine mean?
Uncorrupted.
Uncorrupted. Yeah. Basically, it's an original condition or state that is unspoiled or unspotted. And that basically means looking backwards to clarify and understand the old, but not the old in the sense of aged, infirm, or outdated, but old in the sense of first. And I think that's an important thing. Go to the book of Jude for me. So I'm going to read a couple of different verses here. Jude 1. Not chapter 1 because there is only one chapter. But Jude verse 1. Says, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to those who are called, sanctified by God the Father, and preserved in Jesus Christ, mercy, peace, and love be multiplied to you. Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, we've referenced this verse quite a lot because the goal of our ministry, well, we have several different facets to our goal, but one of the goals of our ministry is to get back to this pristine faith, to shed the errors of denominationalism and understand the Bible the way that it was originally transmitted from Christ to the apostles and from apostles to the next generation of church leaders. And notice in verse 3 where Jude says that the faith was once for all delivered to the saints. This is the same once that Paul uses in Hebrews 9 when he's arguing how the Old Testament sacrifices were a foreshadow of Christ. And they were a foreshadow of Christ entering into the temple, and that being a foreshadow and not being the real thing, the high priest had to reenact this type of Christ's sacrifice every single year. And then he says, but Christ, and this is Hebrews 9:28 if you want to look at it later, he says, but Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. And it's the same once that we see there that we see in Jude, where Jude says that the faith was delivered once for all. And what Jude is saying is that once John closed the New Testament by recording the book of Revelation, that was it. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13 that prophecy would stop. He said, when that which is perfect or complete shall come, then prophecies will stop, tongues will cease. And it's connected to the closing of the canon. It was connected to the delivering of the faith once and for all. Jesus said at the end of the book of Revelation, "For I testify to everyone who hears the word of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds to these things, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book." And a lot of scholars and theologians will say, well, he was just talking about the book of Revelation. I would absolutely agree with that. But the book of Revelation was the last work of the last apostle. And we have, these statements by Paul and by Jude that's saying there's going to come a point where the things that we need to know from God have been given to us. And our job is to understand that rather than to try to modify or change. When Kathy and I were driving to church this morning, I don't know how you found it. She was on her phone and found something. Recently there was something called, what was it called? The Nashville... It was like the Nashville Statement or something like that. And it was a group of 100 or 150 so evangelical Christians that basically put out a statement of faith reaffirming marriage between a man and woman and all godly principles, right? Heterosexuality and all this kind of stuff. That was very quickly countered by a group calling themselves Christians United. And they put out a statement to refute the Nashville Statement. Now, the Nashville Statement is good. It's good, solid biblical perspective on man and woman and marriage and all that kind of stuff. And so this group, Christians United, came out in statement against the Nashville Statement, and it was apparently signed by several reverends, priests, different scholars, different theologians, and it was all started by a guy who pastors a church. He was the graduate of Moody Bible Institute. He pastors a church out in California, and he's bisexual. And so they came out stating that our job is to listen to the Holy Spirit, who is obviously inspiring man to go and revisit our thoughts on gender and marriage and sexuality, to include to be more like Christ in our inclusiveness, because we're all children of God and we're all made in his image. Some kind of errors have very, very significant impacts. Now, going back to this idea that God said through his word, through his apostles, that there would come a time when his instructions were closed, the body of knowledge that he wanted us to master would have a beginning and an end point, and it would have a future because of the prophecies that were contained in there. But we didn't have to wait long until after the apostles died before we started to see errors creeping into church. In fact, it started to happen even before the last apostle died. Matthew 7, verse 15. This is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 7, Jesus warned the disciples. He says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits." Now, he was talking to the disciples, right, out of which group would eventually come the apostles. But I want you to notice there that Jesus didn't say to the apostles, hey, listen, a couple of hundred years, a couple of centuries down the road, you're going to need to warn people that there's going to be people coming within the church, or wolves in sheep clothing. He said, no, you, the disciples, the people I'm talking to right now, you need to be careful of this. Because the error in the church was literally just around the corner. Go to Acts chapter 20. We'll take a look at what Paul said about the very same thing. I'm going to read in 26, Acts 20:26. "Therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. Take heed therefore to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God which he purchased with his blood. For I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves." So Paul is saying, when I die, things are going to start to fall apart. Now, when did Paul die?
67.
About AD 67, right? Just a few years before the Romans came back and destroyed the temple again. So Not long after Christ died and was resurrected, and we see the apostles spreading the gospel, and we see these great works and the missionary trips of Paul, we're starting to see the fulfillment, and we're starting to see the continued warning. But there's a couple of things I want to point out here. Like Jude's comment about the gospel or the body of knowledge we are to master being delivered once for all, Paul said, I have not failed to deliver the whole counsel of God. And what that means is he's saying, guys, I didn't leave anything out. Whatever God instructed me, I have shared with you. I have not failed to deliver the whole counsel. And just like Jesus, Paul warned about these savage wolves. But the kicker here is that in the context of Acts 20, Paul was talking to the church leaders about savage wolves coming up from within the church leadership itself. And that's probably why one of the reasons that Paul was so particular in his instructions to both Timothy and Titus in ordaining elders in the church, right? He begins with the characteristics and the qualities of an elder. They have to be older, they have to be wiser, they have to be experienced, they have to have well-ordered families, can't have kids, being completely disobedient and all that stuff. Go to Titus 1:7. I want to show you a few things there. So again, Paul gives these instructions about the qualifications for elders and for deacons and bishops. And he goes through the characteristics, but in Titus 1:7, he adds some other things. He says, for a bishop must be blameless, as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, wholly self-controlled. And in verse 9, he says, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able, by sound doctrine, both to exhort and convict those who contradict. For there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. He's talking about Jews who had converted Christianity, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. Now, when he says in verse 13, this testimony is true, he's not agreeing with the statement about the Cretans. He's saying, I'm not lying to you. There are actually people in the church who are saying these things. So he says, this testimony is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work. And he continues on in verse 1 of chapter 2, but as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith and love and in patience. Skip down to verse 6 for me. Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, and doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say. Now, when I was reading this morning, when Kathy showed me this article, and I was reading the statement on the website of this group, Christians United, they were making an argument that basically exactly what I'm saying here. We're smarter now than the old Christians or the older generations. And they kept talking about how, the things that evangelical, fundamental Christians believe about marriage and gender and sexuality are culturally based. They were historical errors. And that the Holy Spirit is calling us to re-examine and to re-understand what God really meant when he gave us that information. Now, in that group of verses that we just read in Titus, I want you to notice the references to turning from the faith. This is turning from that body of doctrine. We commonly call it the apostolic faith or the apostolic teaching, the apostolic doctrine, but turning away from that faith, that body of knowledge and understanding that was once for all delivered to the saints. Right? He's talking about that here. He talks about avoiding fables and commandments of men. And we know that Jesus warned about the traditions of men. Back in, for example, Mark 7, chapter 7, verse 8, he said, and he was talking about the Pharisees. He said, for laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men. The washing of pitchers and cups and many other such things you do. All too well, you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. And Paul in Corinthians 2:8 says, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit according to the tradition of men. According to the basic principles of the world and not according to Christ. Mankind always has and always will have a tendency to add to and take away from what God has given him. Agreed or disagreed? Yeah. As if God's supply and God's instruction was insufficient, or as if we are smarter than the ones that he actually entrusted to instruct us to be faithful stewards of that body of knowledge and to transmit that from generation to generation. Take a look at Titus 2:7 while you're there. And I want you to notice the requirement that young men be incorruptible in doctrine. Clearly the onus on every generation of Christians was and is to preserve the original teachings of the apostles. In one of our Bereans principles, in our Bereans study classes, basically, this is restated, but it basically says whatever is new is not true and whatever is true is not new. You guys have heard me quote that before. And throughout that section of verses, Paul uses the word sound several times. He refers to sound doctrine, sound faith, and sound speech. What does the word sound mean? And it's not auditory stuff. What is sound doctrine or sound faith?
Good information.
Good information. Okay.
Complete truth.
Complete truth. What's that?
Solid.
Solid. Yeah, I think all of those are kind of getting towards it. In the context here, it means correct. Sound doctrine is the truth. It is the correct teaching. Because despite what you see in modern Christianity, which is, basically everyone these days, you have license to teach whatever you want, especially if you claim that you're being guided by the Holy Spirit. That's like the Wild West out there from a doctrinal standpoint. So the word sound means correct, but it's from a Greek root word that has implications for health, which is kind of interesting, right? And the root word basically means to be free from disease, to be free from infection or free from infirmity. And that root word is where we get the word hygiene. And this brings us back to the idea of the pristine faith. It's the faith that is unspotted and unspoiled. It has not been infected by the will or the thoughts of man. It is what God wants us to know in the form that he wants us to know it. And what Paul is saying to Timothy and Titus is to appoint elders and bishops who meet certain criteria. Perhaps one of the most important is their ability to preserve the truth. To preserve the truth. To assume that we're smarter now than the earliest Christians, particularly the first generation of Christians that came after the apostles, has certain implications in my mind. Number one is that if we believe that we're smarter now than the early church, is to say that the apostles failed to wisely choose and adequately train their successors. Which ultimately means that Jesus failed in his mission to train and equip his own apostles. Not likely. Or maybe at the very least that he set them up for failure, knowing that that second generation after he left the earth would fail to pass on the truth. And to me, neither conclusion is acceptable. Nor logical. So here's my message for the modern church. We are not smarter in any way than the original or the early church. Nor do we know more or understand the Bible more clearly than the Christians of the first century. Stop going to churches, stop reading books, stop listening to audios for anyone who claims that they have new insight and new revelation from the Lord. or anyone who teaches anything that contradicts and conflicts with the pristine faith, the sound doctrines of the apostle and the early church.
If anything else, we look at what we've gone through in the past years. We come to find out that the more we study, the more we realize we didn't know what we thought we did.
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty rich history of going, oops, we were wrong on that, don't we? I mean, we've actually overturned quite a few false teachings in our own ministry in our church in the last 3 to 5 years.
It goes back to the discernment, though, too, right? I mean, it can change your way. I'm not necessarily change, but I think the Spirit has a way of helping you understand certain things at different points in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for me, anyway.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Now, maybe you're thinking, maybe you're not, but maybe you're thinking, well, you know, this whole thing about learning the truth as Jesus taught the apostles and the apostles taught the first church, isn't that why we have seminaries and theologically based educational institutions, right? So the church can teach the truth to the students who will then become ministers, priests, and pastors. Which brings me to epic fail number 9. What's that? Go ahead.
Well, that was going to go there, but you're going there. So
I am going there. Epic fail number 9 is too much emphasis on seminary training and modern biblical scholars. Now, does anybody know in church history when the first seminary showed up?
I'm not going to say 1800s, but probably way before that.
Yeah. How about 180? So really, the first seminary showed up in Alexandria, Egypt at the end of the 2nd century. Most common date given for this is 180 BC. Not BC, sorry, AD. And the school was called the, what is it? I can't, it's a complicated word, but it's catechechical. The Catechechical School of Alexandria was started by a man named Pentaenus, and then he handed over to Clement of Alexandria, who then handed it over to a man named Origen, and then succeeded on down through the generations. But Pentaenus, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen basically were all Greek trained philosophers, and they were from the school of Plato and the Stoics, which were different, Greek traditions and philosophical thought and learning. And their stated purpose was to reconcile their newfound Christianity with what they had already accepted as true, having been trained in Greek philosophy. And the School of Alexandria was purely an educational institution modeled after the teaching style and the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who maintained, and the school maintained, that God could largely be known through the logic and the reason of man, and they emphasized an allegorical approach to interpreting the Bible with the goal of understanding how the human and the divine can be united. That was the first seminary. Now, about 100 years or so after that, sometime in the 3rd century, the 2nd seminary was started up in Antioch, called the School at Antioch. And this is the city where Paul was sent out from. And while the school in Alexandria focused on allegorical interpretation and the application of human and reasoning and logic to figure out the nature of God, the school in Antioch had what's called a typological interpretational approach, meaning that they believed that the Bible was largely to be taken literally. How about that? But not only that, but that the New Testament was to be understood in light and against the backdrop of the Old Testament. How about that? What's that? What a concept. That's right. So we have the first seminary about 180 AD, somewhere in the 230s, 240s. We have the School of Antioch. At the turn of the 4th century, now we're getting into the early 300s, Emperor Constantine, the Roman Emperor Constantine, basically legalized Christianity with what's called the Edict of Milan, which is in 313 AD. And we know from history, of course, that Constantine allied with the Bishop of Rome to use Christianity to unite his empire, and he lent the power of the Roman army to the Bishop of Rome to spread Christianity throughout the continent. Now, by this time, in the early 300s, several disputes had risen about fundamental concepts and fundamental doctrines, such as the nature and the essence of the Son, the nature and essence of the Father, and the relationship that they had with each other. And there were other things. But Constantine, looking at his efforts to use Christianity to unite his kingdom and his empire, but understanding that within what was known as Christianity at the time, now we had started to see these divergent views cropping up, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and he gathered upwards of 1,800 bishops and deacons and priests, and he gathered them together in one place to hash out a formal declaration of faith and doctrine. And these things, the results of the Nicene Council, became the authorized foundation of Roman Catholicism, which of course was promoted and perpetuated as being the only true religion and the only true faith. And if you didn't agree with what the Roman Catholic Church said was true Christianity, then watch out. In fact, one of the earlier detractors, or one of the men who kind of started a school of thought called Arianism, his name was Arius. He had different beliefs than what most of the bishops and the deacons and the elders had about the nature of Christ and his relationship with the Son. Some of what he taught is what we believe now, not everything, so we can't say that we are Arians. But there is a quotation from the Council of Nicaea, a statement that Constantine made, because he commanded that every work of Arius be found and burned. And if you were found to have a writing of Arius in your possession after the proclamation went out, the penalty was death. That's our early history. Now, because the Roman Catholic Church was growing rapidly and it was venturing into pagan territories and trying to spread the gospel, the church had to have some way to teach new converts about the fundamentals of the Catholic faith. So starting about the 5th century, which is really the dawn or the beginning of the Middle Ages, what we see was that religious orders provided Christian education in what was called cathedral schools or monastic schools. And basically, these were taught by local bishops and local elders, and the first purpose of these cathedral or monastic schools was catechism, which is basically teaching new converts about the beliefs and about the sacraments of the Catholic faith, about things like baptism and marriage and priesthood and all those different things. I know some of you guys are ex-Catholics. And over time, these cathedral and monastic schools, which were originally taught to teach pagan converts about the Catholic faith, they became learning centers for the children of local nobility, and ultimately they became a training ground for men who sought a career in the church. But these schools didn't train priests. These monastic schools didn't train priests. What they did was they focused on spiritual and ascetic practices, and they mixed that with secular training in things like literature and mathematics. Now, in terms of training priests for the early church, after Constantine spread Catholicism throughout his empire, educated men were then chosen from the educated students within these monastic schools, and they were trained as priests by apprenticing them in local churches. So even these early kind of prototypical seminaries didn't teach the things that you and I would be studying or are studying today. They were just general educational schools, and then from them people were taken out and placed in churches to apprentice to the priesthood. Now these very early schools, these monastic schools, are considered to have been responsible for the preservation of classical works like Aristotle and Plato. And we see statements in some of the historical records that in between the daily routines of prayer and eating and sleeping and, say, tending gardens, the monastic students spent most of their additional time studying and copying ancient Greek texts and secular work. Now, can you see the importance of this? and the impact of how Christianity was developing in its thought process over time. Does that concern you guys at all? Right, to understand that the early church had their priests in training spend most of their time interacting with Greek philosophy. I don't think you can go through that without having it affect your thought process. Now, over the next 500 years, these cathedral or these monastic schools eventually transitioned into the very first medieval universities, and they became the centers for higher learning. The very first university to appear was the University of Bologna in Italy. And this was they received their first charter in 1158 AD. So, Walter, you're kind of close, a little bit.
I was thinking about America as well.
Yeah, America was quite a bit later. The University of Paris received this charter not long after the University of Bologna. It was about 1200 AD, and that was followed by Oxford University in 1248. The University of Paris came on to become the world center for religious and secular education, and they offered studies in arts, medicine, law, and theology. And you had to have an arts degree before you could go on to study any of the other ones. And it became the training ground for the Protestant priests on the heels of the Protestant Reformation, which happened somewhere in the early 1500s. Now, in the mid to late 1500s, as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance period, the Roman Catholic Church saw that they were now at a disadvantage, because after the Protestants reformed and they split away from the Roman Catholic Church, they were sending their ministers to these universities like the University of Paris, and they were producing priests that were more thoroughly and highly educated than their Catholic counterparts. Only about 1 in 4 Catholic priests at this point had any higher or formal education beyond what they learned in these monastic schools. And so what the Catholic Church did was they convened what's called the Council of Trent in 1945, and they met 18 different times over that, 25 times over that 18-year period of time. And the Council of Trent was a counter-reformation. It was designed to counter the allegations of the reformers, and it included the first modern reference to the seminary, using the word in Latin seminarium, which literally means seedbed. The Catholic seminary then, and in fact in the Council of Trent, now all this stuff is available online. If you want to read the proceedings of the Council of Trent, you can find that online very easily. But in the Council of Trent, in one of their documents, was a mandate to establish these training grounds. And what happened was the Catholic seminary then became the training ground for the Catholic priesthood, with the Roman Catholic Church claiming sole authority to ordain ministers. In fact, they went so far as to say this. This is from the 23rd session of the Council of Trent, chapter 4, on the ecclesiastical hierarchy and on ordination. It says the sacred and holy synod teaches that in ordination of bishops, priests, and other orders, neither the consent, vocation, authority, whether of the people or of any civil power or magistrate whatsoever is required. Basically, they're saying we can do what we want. Rather, doth it decree that all those who, being only called and instituted by the people, or by the civil power and magistrate, ascend to the exercise of these ministrations, and those whom of their own rashness assume them to themselves, are not ministers of the church, but are to be looked upon as thieves and robbers who have not entered by the door. Kind of amazing, isn't it? Now, this shift to an institutional approach to training the priesthood was mirrored by the Protestants. And initially, again, the reformers sent their men to general universities, but about 100 years after the Council of Trent, where the Catholics said, we're the only people who can train priests, and we're going to do it our way. About 100 years after that, the Protestants responded by opening Harvard University in 1636, which was originally a Christian university. And then they opened Yale in 1701. But eventually Harvard and Yale rejected Orthodox Christianity, and the Protestants opened their own dedicated seminaries, just like the Roman Catholic Church did. Now, that's a big whole history lesson. That's how we got to where we are today in the modern church. Not just with a split between Catholic and Protestant seminary training, but now with seminaries in the Protestant world aligned along the lines of different Protestant denominations. Here in the United States alone, there are hundreds of seminaries split among 23 different denominations. And that's not even including what's happening in other countries in the world. Now, why is this important for us to understand? I know some of the history can be a little bit hard, but why is it important for us to understand where seminaries came from and what they're doing to people who are studying and graduating there? What do you think? Yeah.
I think a lot of people, my brother church shops, and he looks to see whether or not the pastor has a doctorate degree.
Yeah, we had a conversation with our brother several years ago, and he said, I refuse to go to a church unless the pastor has a PhD. And he was going to a church that he absolutely loved until everyone found out that the pastor was sleeping with a secretary. So having an educational degree, an advanced degree, doesn't guarantee moral character.
Which is kind of interesting, because then it's just like, well, then would you listen to any of the apostles? Because none of them had degrees. Or
That's right.
Like, so it's
Yeah,
like,
what seminary did they go to?
Well,
Yeah.
The seminary of
Those
Jesus.
things are
The cemetery.
So
Seminary.
being taught by Jesus Christ personally, that was
Yeah.
their seminary.
Yes, that's right.
That's what they thought.
So here's why part of this is important, because all these different seminaries teach different things. But what did Jude say? What did Paul say? Sound doctrine, correct doctrine, unity in faith, the faith that was once for all delivered. There should be no diversity of opinion. If there is, where does it come from?
Man.
It comes from the mind and the heart of man. And so all of these different denominations and these different seminaries that train priests and pastors and ministers in different traditions represent anything but the unity of the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. And what has evolved from seminary training is that most churches require pastoral staff to have degrees in biblical studies. And the further you want to go in a denomination, the better it is if you have more advanced degrees. Guys like me would never get hired in a denominational church because I am largely self-taught and mentored by other great men of faith who have astounding biblical studying and communication and teaching skills. Willing to ask tough questions and accept the answers no matter what they are, even if they differ from what we already hold to be true. So why do you think modern Christianity places such a premium on formal biblical education?
I think we'd have to go from the secular side. Being as a college student, they have put so much emphasis that in order for you to be successful in life, you need to have a degree.
Yeah,
And so in order for you to know the Bible, you need to have a degree.
yeah.
And so if you don't have a degree, then why am I going to learn from you?
Yeah, like there's this quest for credentials, right? And this is, it's part of the world that I live in. In my primary job, my primary vocation, the more letters you have after the name, the more respect that you garner, right? And I remember back when I did my first undergraduate degree, I did business, and it was becoming apparent. This was back in the say late 80s, early 90s, it was becoming apparent that having a business degree or a Bachelor of Commerce degree wasn't enough, that pretty soon you're going to have an MBA. And now having an MBA doesn't guarantee anything. So I think it's generally assumed that formal higher education is superior to self-learning. But I think things like homeschool have disabused us of that notion, because routinely homeschool kids outperform their institutional counterparts. Let me ask you this question, or just take a second and ask this to yourself. Like, what is the ultimate outcome of a seminary-based education?
You just teach.
Yeah, teach, sure. What's the outcome, though?
Whatever they
You're going to
teach
be
you.
an extension of that church's agenda.
Yeah, there's a word that describes that.
Kool-Aid.
Drinking the Kool-Aid. How about indoctrination?
There we go.
You know, the ultimate outcome of a seminary education is indoctrination into the history and the tradition of the denomination that owns or sponsors that particular seminary. Now, he's not really an active part of our broader fellowship much anymore, but years ago, one of Tim's good friends, Roger, who is basically a great Hebrew and Greek scholar, he went through seminary training. He went through all the classes, did all the work, and when he went to defend his thesis, his dissertation, to get his degree, they said, wow, this is some amazing work. But you're not agreeing with our statement of faith, so we're not going to let you graduate and give your diploma. Even though they agreed with his exegetical approach to the original languages, and he actually showed them where certain translations were in error, they said, this is fantastic work, we just can't give you a degree.
They gave him an A, though.
They gave him an A, but they wouldn't give him a degree.
They didn't want their name associated with him,
Yeah,
or vice versa. That's sad.
it is sad. But I think the average Christian, like my brother-in-law, has this perception that in the modern church, if you have a credential, it means you know more and you are more adequately able to handle the scriptures. Well, if that is true, why do they all disagree? But I get this idea that seminaries are designed to standardize education. I think that that's generally a good thing. But are all seminary educated people biblical scholars? And are all competent scholars trained only in seminaries? And the answer is no to both of those. But it raises a question: what's the difference between an educated Christian and a scholar? Because to the modern world, the scholar is the better of the two. Let me propose this. An educated Christian may have learned to toe the party line, to drink the Kool-Aid, and only to parrot or regurgitate what they had learned from somebody else. That's an educated Christian, or can be. A scholar, on the other hand, is somebody who has learned to question. Someone who's learned how to question the generally accepted doctrine, who has learned how to question the Bible itself like a Berean, who Paul said, now the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. And they received the word with gladness, but went home every day to search the scriptures to see if what Paul taught was true. That's a scholar. But being named a scholar, being named a scholar does not automatically mean that your word on the word is gospel. And what has developed, or perhaps just continued, is a system where the academic elite sit around and congratulate themselves on how smart they all are. And they've created their own little club that has largely excluded the common Christian and perpetuates the errors that come from having a lack of unity in faith and doctrine. And this should sound familiar to us.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, because who else did the exact same thing?
Who else did the exact same thing?
Yeah.
Some of the priests and
Scribes and the Pharisees.
Exactly.
They did the exact same thing, right? But God's intent for the new covenant age, right, the period that we are in, is that the Bible should be accessible. That body of knowledge that was once for all delivered to the saints should be accessible and understandable by everyone as individuals. And as individuals within the context of a fellowship and a group of people who are committed to studying the truth no matter where it leads them. And that's why, years ago we started our Bereans Bible Institute, and we made quite literally a seminary level education available for free online. Because we want Christians to take ownership of their faith. We want to give them a structured and a disciplined way to study the Scripture, which I think is one of the characteristics of a scholar, is that they don't just approach the Word with what their thought process is. They have a structured and disciplined way to investigate the truth. And they recognize their own philosophical and presuppositional biases, and they work diligently to remove those because they are detractors from the truth. I said earlier that one of the goals of our ministry is to allow people to shed errors of denominationalism and return to the pristine faith. And so I'm going to end our session today by very quickly reviewing the 8 principles that we've published on our website that we use in our personal as well as our corporate study to help us to look at doctrinal positions and give us the greatest chance that the conclusions that we're going to come to are the right ones, that they're in line with the truth as what God intended. I know a lot of you guys have seen these before, but I'm willing to bet, just like most of you probably couldn't name all 12 apostles, you probably couldn't recite all these 8 principles. So these are the rules that we use. Number 1, the original scriptures are infallible in the original languages. Now what that means is that every single English translation has mistakes. Every single one. The only thing that is free from error is the original language. Hebrew and Greek grammar cannot be violated or ignored, but must guide interpretation. Let me give you a good example of this. You know, the scripturally, whenever the topic of the return of Christ comes up, and if anyone ever dares suggest some kind of a biblical timeline that connects creation to the return of Christ, the first thing that typically comes up is what?
Matthew 24:36.
Which is?
No one knows the day or the hour.
Yeah, no one knows the day or the hour, and they use that as like their default.
Yeah.
And it was mine for many years. Until Tim, who knows a heck of a lot more about Greek and Hebrew than I do, pointed out that that was written in the present tense. And the force of the Greek in the present tense can only be applied to the present and not to the future. If Jesus' intent was to say, nobody will ever figure this out until I'm actually on my way down, he would have said, nobody will ever know. He would have used the future tense. He used the present tense, which means as of this moment, nobody knows. But it does not preclude knowing in the future. You cannot violate Hebrew and Greek grammar. Number 3, interpret within the historical situation, culture, and literary context. And this is against the tendency for Christians, especially in Bible study groups, to go, well, what does this mean to you? And before you can ask that question, before you ask that question, you have to ask this question. What did it mean to them? What did it mean to the people that this word was spoken to? What did they already know about the gospel? Where were they in history? What were their cultural influences? What was their background? And you cannot answer, what does this mean to me, until you know what it meant to them. Principle number 4. Interpret the text literally unless compelling evidence demands non-literal interpretation. Now, the Bible is full of allegory and metaphor and imagery, but it's usually pretty clear when God had his people use metaphor and allegory and imagery. And the solution to what does this metaphor or image mean is almost always found in the Old Testament. We should not have to go outside of the biblical record to explain an allegory and metaphor or understand an image. In fact, I had an email from somebody just recently who is struggling with, and it's not somebody who's part of our fellowship, but somebody who is struggling with, I've always felt that there was a God, but I'm not convinced that it's the God of the Bible. And he's starting to go off into Christian authors who teach that the entire Bible is allegorical and has to be understood within the context of mysticism. And I said to him, you have to be very, 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 very careful of that, because what happens when you approach everything from a mystical or an allegorical standpoint?
You can twist it to mean whatever you want.
That's right, you remove objectivity. You remove objectivity, and you become the sole arbiter of what something means and doesn't mean. And you can make it mean whatever you want. And so the primary interpretational method of the Bible, like the school in Antioch, is let's start with the literal meaning and understand it from the perspective of the audience that it was intended for, and then we can maybe start looking at whether or not there's any mystical meanings to that, right? And sometimes every once in a while you get things that have kind of dual meaning or dual interpretation, but the answers to those things are still found objectively in the Bible, and they shouldn't be coming from personal or divine revelation. Principle number 5, interpret progressively, with newer revelation always complementing older revelation. The school in Antioch taught that the New Testament should be understood with the backdrop of the Old Testament. The Bible from Genesis to Revelation is one continuous story. And so if we look back at what is being taught in one place in the Bible to a particular group of people with a certain amount of knowledge, but you and I know, because we read later in the book, that later something else was taught, we can't understand this in the context of what we understand about the later revelation, because the original audience didn't have that yet. The book of Revelation is a book that a lot of people stay away from because they just don't understand it. But I can guarantee you that every single symbol and image in the book of Revelation is found in the Old Testament. Yeah, I think if you, like, one of the worst things that we could have ever seen in the modern church is, the separation of the Old Testament from the New. Number 6, almost done. Reject as illogical all doctrines that require holding mutually exclusive ideas. What does mutual exclusivity mean?
Means it's the same for everyone.
Well, mutual exclusivity means it can't be both. So how can Jesus be fully God and fully man? Oh, it's a divine mystery. God's ways are not our ways. Mutual exclusivity is a sign of false teaching. So it's a faulty understanding. Everything we believe has to fit together. There should be no conflict. There should be harmony. One of the greatest tests of doctrinal truth is, does it harmonize? And if what you believe forces you to hold mutually exclusive ideas, then you're wrong. The Bible's not, you are. Number 7, all accepted doctrines must be consistent with God's character and with all other true doctrines. Can anyone give me an example that violates this?
Doctrine of hell.
Yeah? How so?
Well, because a just God would not throw somebody, throw their ghost into a pit of torture and torment before being judged. And to judge a person all eternity for what they did 20 to 80 years on this earth and who never without end is a cruel, mean, vicious, unjust God.
Yeah. Justice puts limits on judgment and punishment. Right? So it is, we understand this in the human sphere. Let's say I'm speeding and a cop pulls me over and I got sentenced to 30 years in jail because I broke the speed limit. I was doing like 8 miles an hour over, or 12. Is that justice? No. It would be just to get a fine, a speeding ticket. That would be perfect justice. So God's justice tells us what will happen if this, then that, but it puts a limit. Justice always puts a limit on punishment. Here's another example, is Calvinism. Right? Calvinism is God made some people to not be saved and be evil, and others to be saved, and they didn't have any choice. Yet God holds the evil people accountable, and in the Calvinistic system, believing in a literal hell with constant eternal torment and punishment for things that they had no help in doing. Calvinism makes God the author of all evil, and it contradicts God's character. Number 8 and final, trace modern doctrines back to the source to see when, where, and why they originated. What is true is not new, and what is new is not true. Give me an example of that. Kathy had one earlier.
You
Yeah,
have to remind me of
Margaret
this.
MacDonald.
Oh, that was.
The preacher of rapture.
Earlier, yeah.
Yeah, when did the preacher of rapture show up in church history?
Well, actually, it was a Jesuit priest before that who came up with the idea, but later on, Martin MacDonald had this so-called dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, so late 1700s.
Yeah, Margaret MacDonald was in the 1800s, but either way, whether or not you look at, I can't remember, it was like Alonzo or something, I can't remember the guy's name, Esposito. You're talking 18th, 19th century. Yet the faith was once for all delivered to the saints, and that canon was closed before the end of the first century.
What do you want to say about what you say, prior to 1500 AD, that theology did not exist. It was taught by modern.
Or may have in small pockets, but certainly around that time exploded, right?
It actually did not exist. The way that John Calvin came up with perseverance of the saints, it wasn't taught that way.
Yeah, that way, exactly. So these are the things that we hold it true. I mean, just to close this out, because I know we have our church meeting afterwards, but epic fail number one, thinking that we're smarter than they are. And looking forward to new stuff rather than spending our time looking back to clarify where we're wrong about what God originally wants us and still wants us to understand. And epic fail number 9 is the reliance of modern church, or the assignment of more value to somebody's knowledge or experience or teaching just simply based on academic credentials. And hopefully by tracing the development of how the seminary system brought us to where we are right now, kind of helps you understand how faulty that whole system is.